The noon sun beat down on the dry earth, the kind of heat that made the horizon dance and the skin itch with sweat. Caleb Monroe reined in his bay horse at the rise of a hill and tipped his hat against the glare. Below him, in the hollow, sat the ranch he'd bought for the price of a single silver dollar. From a distance, it looked half dead, roof shingles missing, porch sagging, the yard overrun with weeds. Folks in town had shaken their heads when he signed the papers. "Cursed land," they'd whispered. "No man keeps it long." But Caleb had never been much for superstition. He was 40 now, with too many miles behind him and not much to show for them. A patch of land, even one left to rot, was better than drifting. He clicked his tongue and urged the horse forward, the gate coming into view. The wood was sun-bleached, cracked from years without care. Caleb swung down, boots raising small clouds of dust, and pushed it open with a groan of hinges. The yard lay silent, save for the rasp of cicadas. Yet as he stepped closer to the porch, a prickle wobbed down his neck, the sharp sense of eyes on him. Then the door creaked. A woman stood framed in the shadows, a child balanced on her hip. She was younger than Caleb expected, her hair dark and loose, her face pale from worry more than rest. 3 other children clung to her skirts, their little faces smeared with dust, eyes wide and watchful. Caleb froze, hand instinctively brushing the butt of his revolver before he caught himself. These weren't outlaws, these were survivors. The woman's voice was low, but it carried across the yard. "This place isn't yours." Caleb straightened slowly. "Bank says otherwise. Monroe's the name. Bought it fair in town." Her jaw tightened. Then the bank sold what wasn't theirs to give. The youngest child fussed, and she shifted her weight, patting the little one's back. The other 3 pressed tighter against her legs, eyes never leaving him. Caleb took in the scene, the thinness of their arms, the patched dresses, the shoes nearly worn through. Whatever story lay behind their being here, it wasn't one of ease. "You live in here?" he asked. She lifted her chin, though her lips trembled. "Since spring. We had nowhere else." Caleb scratched his beard, thinking. He hadn't counted on squatters, much less a widow with 4 young mouths. He should have been angry, should have told her to clear out. But the way the boy, 6, maybe 7 years old, stepped half in front of his sisters, fists clenched as if to fight a man twice his size, made something inside Caleb twist. "I ain't here to throw anyone to the dust," he said finally. "But I've put what little I had into this land. We'll have to find some way to make it right." The woman's eyes flickered, not with relief, but with a guarded sorrow. She gave a small knead, and without another word, turned and led the children back inside. That night, Caleb made a small fire by the barn and cooked beans from his saddlebag. He could see the light of a lamp glowing faintly behind the house's warped window. The children's voices rose and fell, soft and muffled. He wondered how long they'd been living like this, half hidden, half starving, clinging to a house no one else wanted. The next day he set to work. The well rope was rotted clean through, so he replaced it with his own. By midday, he'd drawn up a bucket of clear water. He'd just set it down when he heard a soft step behind him. The woman stood a few feet away holding a tin cup. She didn't look at him as she dipped the cup and handed it to the eldest girl, who drank greedily. Then the others followed. Caleb said nothing, only tipped his hat and went back to his work. By the 3rd morning, she spoke. "My name is Ruth," she said quietly. "Ruth Gardner." Caleb nodded. "Caleb Monroe." She hesitated, her hands twisting the fabric of her skirt. "My husband, he passed in the winter. Fever. Left us with nothing but this place. I didn't know where else to go." Caleb studied her face. He'd seen that kind of loss before. The look of someone still standing only because little ones needed them to. He felt the ache of it stir old memories, graves he didn't visit anymore. "Sorry for your loss," he said gruffly. Then after a moment added, "A place can be brought back, if you've got the grit for it." Her eyes searched his as if weighing his truth, but she only nodded and returned to the house. The days settled into a wary rhythm. Caleb patched fence and cleared weeds. Ruth tended to the children, though sometimes he caught the eldest girl watching him with curious eyes. He left a strip of venison on the porch after a hunt. The next morning, he found a loaf of bread by his fire. Slowly, the walls between them thinned. One evening, as he leaned against the corral rail, Ruth came out to stand a few paces away. Her face was pale in the moonlight. "You ought to know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband owed men, not the sort you can pay with coin. If they come looking, they won't care who you are." Caleb's jaw worked. He thought of the 4 children inside that house, of Ruth's thin shoulders and steady, frightened eyes. "Then I reckon I'll be here when they do," he said. She looked at him a long time, as though trying to decide if he meant it. Finally, she turned and went inside. 2 nights later, the dogs barked, a low, growling alarm that lifted Caleb from his bedroll before his eyes were even open. He grabbed his rifle and stepped out into the cool dark. 3 riders sat at the far edge of the yard, cigarettes glowing red in the night. Their laughter carried sharp across the silence. One called out, his voice rough, "Bank paper don't mean spit here, stranger. That house, that land, they're ours." Behind Caleb, the door opened. Ruth stood with the children huddled close, her face pale as ash. The riders shifted in their saddles, waiting. Caleb leveled his rifle, his voice calm but hard. "Step 1 foot closer, and we'll see who this land truly belongs to." The riders chuckled low, cruel. "Then get ready to prove it." The air between them went taut as wire. Ruth's breath caught in the doorway, the children clutching at her skirts. Caleb stood alone in the yard, rifle steady, heart pounding like a war drum. And the night waited, holding its breath for the first shot. The silence stretched like a wire ready to snap. Caleb Monroe stood in the yard, rifle leveled at the 3 riders who loomed just beyond the fence line. The glow of their cigarettes lit their grins, shadows cutting sharp across their faces. "Best think hard, stranger," the scar-faced one called. "We don't mind filling you with lead and taking what's ours." Behind Caleb, the door creaked. Ruth's voice, soft but unsteady, carried across the night. "Don't." The riders laughed, cruel and mocking. "There she is, little Ruth Gardner. Thought you'd run off by now." Caleb's heart thudded. They knew her name. One of the men spat into the dust. "Your husband owed, and when he died, that debt didn't. You know the terms." His eyes flicked toward the children pressed close to Ruth's skirts. "Debt falls on the family." Caleb's jaw clenched. He shifted his rifle slightly higher. "You'll not touch them." The leader smirked. "Then maybe you'll pay in their place." The words hung, foul, in the cool air. Caleb felt the tremor of the horse beneath him, the shallow breaths of the children behind. A storm of rage churned in his chest. "You've had your say," he growled. "Now ride on before I start picking you off one by one." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then the scar-faced man gave a sharp whistle. The riders wheeled their horses, circling slow before retreating into the dark. Their laughter trailed behind them like a curse. Only when the sound of hooves faded into nothing did Caleb lower his rifle. His breath came hard, though his stance stayed steady. Ruth stood frozen on the porch, her arms wrapped tight around the smallest child. Her face was pale as moonlight, but her eyes glistened with something sharp. Fear, yes, but also shame. "You should have let them go," she whispered. Caleb turned, surprised by her words. "Let them go? They'd have taken you, or worse." Her lips pressed thin. She shook her head. "You don't know what they're capable of. You can't fight them." Caleb stepped closer, his voice firm. "I've seen men like them before. They only take what you let them." Her gaze flicked to the rifle in his hands, then back to his face. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she turned, ushering the children inside without another word. The next morning dawned pale and brittle. Caleb rose early, saddling his horse to ride fence, though his thoughts stayed tangled with the night before. When he returned near noon, he found Ruth at the well, drawing water with practiced strength. The children sat nearby, husking corn with small, nimble hands. She didn't look up as he approached. "They'll be back," she said simply. Caleb tied off his reins. "Let 'em come. They'll find me waiting." She shook her head, the corners of her mouth tightening. "You don't understand. My husband, he wasn't just in debt. He struck a bargain. They believe this place and everything on it belongs to them until the debt is paid." Caleb studied her, the weight of her words pressing heavy. "And you believe that too?" Her hand stilled on the rope, For the first time, she looked at him fully, her eyes dark with exhaustion. I believe men like that don't stop until they've bled you drama. The youngest child whimpered, tugging at her skirt, and Ruth bent to lift her. Caleb saw how her arms trembled from the effort. He saw, too, the thinness of her frame, the sharp hollows of her cheeks. Whatever fear she carried, it had eaten her near to breaking. I ain't here to watch you be bled, Caleb said quietly. Not you, not these children. Ruth's eyes softened, but only for a flicker. Then the guard fell back into place. You don't owe us anything, Mr. Monroe. This isn't your fight. Caleb looked at the four children, their faces turned toward him with uncertain trust. Then at Ruth, standing too proud for someone so worn. He thought of the long, lonely years behind him, of nights spent with only silence for company. And he shook his head. Reckon it is now. That evening, Caleb cooked a pot of beans and hung it over the fire. The children edged closer, drawn by the smell. Ruth lingered on the porch, arms crossed, but she didn't stop them when Caleb handed each a tin plate. As they ate, the boy, the boldest of the lot, looked up at Caleb. You really gonna fight those men? Caleb's mouth twitched with a ghost of a smile. If they give me reason. The boy nodded solemnly as if measuring his answer. Then he said, Pa used to fight too, but he lost. The words cut through the evening like a blade. Ruth stiffened, but Caleb only nodded. Sometimes men do, but sometimes they don't. The boy seemed to weigh that, then went back to eating. Later, as the stars spread across the sky, Ruth stepped down from the porch, her face shadowed in lamplight. She stopped a few paces from Caleb, who sat whittling by the fire. You should know, she said, her voice low. Those men, they don't just want land. They wanted me. That was part of the bargain. Caleb's knife stilled. He lifted his gaze to her, reading the pain in her face. She held it steady, though her hand shook. My husband promised me if he couldn't pay. Said it was the only way to keep us fed through winter. I didn't know until after. Caleb's jaw clenched. He could picture it. The desperation of a man watching his family starve. The cowardice of handing over what should never be bartered. You're not theirs, Caleb said, his voice low but firm. Not now, not ever. Ruth's eyes glistened, but she turned away quickly, as if afraid of what might show. 2 nights later, the riders returned. The dogs barked first, low and urgent. Caleb was already awake, rifle in hand before the hoofbeats reached the yard. This time there were more, 5, maybe 6 shadows moving at the fence line. Monroe, the scar-faced man called. You've had your fun playing landowner. Time to hand over what don't belong to you. Caleb stepped into the yard, lantern light catching the edge of his hat. His rifle gleamed steady in his hands. You're standing on my ground. That means you've got till the count of 3 to clear out. Laughter rippled through the night. One of the men raised his pistol and fired into the air, the shot echoing across the valley. The children cried out from inside the house. Ruth held them close, her face pale as chalk. Caleb's voice rang clear. 1. The men shifted in their saddles, uncertain. 2. The scar-faced man sneered. You don't scare us. 3. The crack of Caleb's rifle split the night. One rider tumbled from his horse, hitting the dust with a thud. The others jerked back, curses flying. The yard exploded with gunfire. Caleb dove for cover behind the corral rail, bullets whining past. He fired steady, deliberate, each shot finding its mark. A horse screamed, reared, and bolted, throwing its rider. Another man clutched his arm and fled into the dark. Still they pressed, shouting threats, their gunfire raking the house. Ruth pulled the children to the floor, her body shielding them as wood splintered around her. The youngest cried, terrified, but Ruth held them tight, whispering prayers into their hair. Outside, Caleb gritted his teeth, the world narrowing to the rifle in his hands, the enemy before him, and the family he swore, without ever saying it aloud, that he would not abandon. At last, the scar-faced man shouted, Enough! His voice was ragged, furious. You've bought yourself a date, Monroe, but we'll be back. And when we come, you won't stand. Their hooves thundered into the distance, swallowed by the dark. Caleb lowered his rifle, chest heaving. He could feel blood sticky on his arm, where a bullet had grazed him, but he stayed standing, watching the horizon until all sound faded. Only then did he turn toward the house. Ruth opened the door slowly, the children clinging to her. Her face was pale, but her eyes shone with something fierce. "You should have run when you had the chance," she whispered. Caleb met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "I don't run. Not anymore." The silence stretched between them, thick with things unspoken. Fear, gratitude, defiance, hope. And in that moment, Ruth knew their lives had changed forever, though neither yet understood how much. The night after the fight settled heavy over the ranch. Smoke still clung to the air, the scent of gunpowder mixing with dust. Caleb sat by the dying fire, sleeve torn, blood seeping slow from the graze on his arm. He worked in silence, binding it with a strip of cloth. The door creaked open. Ruth stepped out, shawl drawn tight around her shoulders. For a long while she said nothing, only stood watching him, her face pale in the moonlight. Finally her voice came, hushed but steady. "You're hurt." Caleb didn't look up. "Not bad. Seen worse." "You shouldn't have stood alone." He gave a faint shrug. "Better me than the lot of you." Her eyes lingered on him, unreadable. Then she lowered herself onto the porch step, not too close, but nearer than before. For a time, the night stretched quiet between them. The children's breathing could be heard faintly from inside, soft and even at last. "They'll be back," she said. "I know." Caleb tightened the knot on the bandage. "But so will I." She looked at him then, really looked, as if trying to decide whether to trust the weight of those words. Her hands twisted in her lap, restless. At last, she whispered, "I've not told you everything." Caleb's head turned, slow and deliberate. He waited. "My husband." Her throat worked around the words. "He wasn't just a man who fell into debt. He was different after the fever swept through town. Restless, angry. He began running goods for men he shouldn't have. They used this ranch for things I didn't understand, things I didn't ask. When he died, I thought it was over, but it wasn't." Caleb's jaw hardened. "So this land's marked dirty in their eyes." Ruth nodded, her gaze dropped to the ground. "They don't want the house, not really. They want what they believe is hidden here. My husband swore he left something behind. Money, or maybe something worse. I've looked. I've searched every inch. There's nothing." The truth spilled between them like water from a cracked jar. Caleb sat still, letting the weight of it settle. "And they think you're keeping it from their mem," he said at the last. Her eyes glistened. "Yes." A long silence followed. Caleb felt the old familiar tug in his chest, the same one that had driven him west years ago, searching for something to make sense of the broken pieces of his own life. He thought of Ruth, thin and tired but fierce, standing between her children and a world that would devour them. And he thought of the men who would come again, not for land, not for coin, but for cruelty. He spoke low, steady. "Then we'll show 'em this place don't hold what they want, and we'll stand until they believe it." Ruth gave a small, trembling laugh. "You talk as if it's simple." "It never is." He met her gaze, his eyes tired but unyielding. "But it's right." For the first time since he'd met her, her lips curved, faint, fleeting, but a smile nonetheless. The days that followed were restless. Caleb worked from dawn until dusk, patching fences, checking stock, setting traps along the ridges. He knew the riders would be back, and when they came, he intended to be ready. Ruth watched him, though she said little. She kept the children busy with chores, their small hands pulling weeds, gathering kindling, fetching water. Yet even as they tried to laugh, shadows lingered in their eyes. They had lived too long under fear's roof. One evening as Caleb split wood, the eldest girl, Mary, just 10, approached shyly. "Mr. Monroe," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He paused, axe resting on the stump. "Yes, ma'am?" Her small chin lifted with surprising courage. "Are you going to leave us too?" The question hit harder than any bullet. Caleb's throat tightened. He crouched down, meeting her gaze. "No," he said simply. "Not unless you send me off." She searched his face as if to measure the truth in his words. Slowly she nodded, then turned and hurried back toward the house. Caleb watched her go, a strange ache in his chest he hadn't felt in years. That night the air turned heavy, clouds rolling low. Caleb sat on the porch listening to the distant rumble of thunder. Ruth joined him, a lantern flickering in her hand. "You've given them hope," she said quietly. Caleb tipped his hat back, studying her face in the lantern glow. "Hope's worth more than coin." Her eyes softened, but her voice trembled. "I'm afraid of what it'll cost you." Before he could answer, a shout split the night. "Monroe!" Caleb shot to his feet, rifle in hand. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the yard. Shapes moved at the fence line. More riders than before. A dozen at least. "Bring her out!" the scar-faced leader bellowed, voice carrying above the storm. "Bring Ruth Gardner, and we'll let the rest live." Ruth's face drained of color. The children cried inside, fear sharp in their small voices. Caleb stepped down into the yard, reins spitting now, rifle steady. "You'll not touch her," he called. Laughter answered him. A dozen shadows dismounted, fanning out through the rain. Caleb's heart pounded. He was one man against many, but he planted his boots firm. He'd seen worse odds in war, and he'd survived. Ruth stepped out onto the porch, shawl pulled tight, eyes wide but blazing. She looked at Caleb, reins slicking his face, rifle raised against the storm. And in that moment she understood. This stranger who had bought the land for $1 had staked something far greater than money, his very life, for them. Thunder boomed, the men shouted. Caleb braced, and the battle for the ranch began. The storm broke full across the valley, rain lashing sideways, wind tearing through the yard like a wild thing. Caleb Monroe stood soaked to the bone, rifle leveled, as a dozen shadowed men closed in. Their shouts mixed with thunder, horses stamping restless in the mud. The scar-faced leader's voice rose above the chaos. "Last chance, Monroe. Hand over the widow, and we'll leave you breathing." Caleb spat rain from his lips, his voice a low growl. "You'll ride over my body before you touch her." Laughter answered him, ugly, cruel. The men surged forward. The first shot cracked from Caleb's rifle, sharp against the storm. A rider pitched from his saddle, crashing into the mud. Chaos erupted. Gunfire, curses, horses screaming. Caleb dove behind the corral rail, firing steady and true, each bullet biting the night. Inside the house, Ruth gathered the children into the back room. The youngest cried, frightened beyond reason, but Ruth hushed them, holding them close. Then, heart-pounding, she crossed to the window. Rain streamed down the glass, but through it she saw Caleb, alone, outnumbered, standing fierce against the storm. Something in her broke then, not in weakness, but in resolve. She could not cower while he bled for them. She snatched up her late husband's shotgun from above the hearth, checking the shells with trembling hands. For years that gun had been only a bitter reminder. Tonight it became her salvation. "Stay here," she told the children, her voice firm despite the tremor in her chest. "No matter what you hear, you stay." Before they could answer, she was out the door, rain plastering her hair to her face. Caleb glanced back, shock flashing in his eyes as he saw her stride into the yard, shotgun braced against her shoulder. "Thought I told you to stay inside," he shouted over the storm. Her jaw set. "And let you fight for us alone? Never." She raised the gun and fired. The blast lit the night, one rider tumbling from his horse. Caleb gave a short nod, then turned back to the fight, rifle cracking in rhythm with the storm. Together they held the line. Ruth's hands shook, but her aim was steered. Born of desperation, Caleb moved with grim precision, every shot measured. The children's faces pressed pale against the window, watching their mother and the stranger battle for their lives. The men pressed harder, shouting curses, their bullets tearing splinters from the porch. One broke through, charging low. Caleb swung his rifle butt hard, sending him sprawling. Ruth fired again, the recoil jarring her shoulder but felling another attacker. The yard became a blur of mud, rain, and fury. Then thunder rolled so loud it shook the earth, and in that moment of nature's roar, silence fell, the outlaws retreating, pulling their wounded, their courage spent. The scar-faced leader lingered, rage burning in his eyes. "This ain't it over, Monroe. You can't keep what was promised." Caleb stepped forward, rifle steady, his face carved from stone. "Then come back and find out. But next time, you won't ride away." The man cursed, spurred his horse, and vanished into the storm with the rest. When silence finally settled, Caleb lowered his rifle, his body shaking with exhaustion. Ruth staggered toward him, rain dripping from her hair, shotgun limp in her hands. For a long moment, they simply stood there, breathing hard, staring at each other through the storm's last fury. Then Caleb spoke, voice rough. "You've got grit, Ruth Gardner." Her lips trembled into the ghost of a smile. "And you've got a stubborn streak that borders on foolishness." They both laughed, weary but alive. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the land washed clean. Smoke curled from the chimney as Ruth cooked for the first time in weeks with a lightness in her step. The children clung to Caleb when he returned from checking the fence line. Their small voices chattering questions. "Did you really scare them off, Mr. Monroe? Are they gone for good? Will you stay?" Caleb looked at their eager faces, then at Ruth, standing in the doorway, her eyes soft with something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in months. Hope. "I'll stay," he said simply. Over the weeks that followed, the ranch began to breathe again. Caleb rebuilt the barn roof. Ruth planted a small garden. The children learned to laugh without flinching at every sound. Life returned, not all at once, but like spring creeping slow across the frozen ground. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields gold, Ruth stepped onto the porch. Caleb sat there already, whittling a small toy horse for the boy. She watched in silence, the sight stirring something deep in her chest. "You came here for land," she said softly. "But you found us instead." Caleb looked up, meeting her gaze with steady warmth. "Maybe land was never what I was meant to find." Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes, but she just smiled through them. For the first time in so long, the future no longer felt like a shadow. And as the children's laughter carried across the yard and the evening breeze stirred the tall grass, Ruth knew the ranch was no longer abandoned. It was home. A man who bought a ranch for $1 found more than land. He found a widow's courage, 4 children's trust, and a reason to stand when the world pressed hardest. And in the heart of the wild frontier, they built something no storm or outlaw could tear down: a family.